Sometimes, the biggest wins aren't achieved directly on the battlefield. They're achieved far more subtly, when the enemy doesn't see an attack coming and ends up dying because of it. Sabotage is as useful a tool to Ukraine in its fight against Putin as the most modern air defense systems, and Ukraine has proven this point many times over. And Ukraine just did it again. Ukraine waited for some of the most important Russians operating in Zaporizhzhia region to go into hiding. When they did, the nightmare began, as Ukraine used fire to destroy any hope Russia had of launching a renewed offensive in Zaporizhzhia. The latest and perhaps one of the greatest Ukrainian sabotage operations took place on August 30 near the village of Voskresenka, though Ukraine kept it under wraps before revealing what it had done on September 18. And there was a good reason for the wait. Ukraine was waiting to confirm the results of a sabotage strike that the Kyiv Post reports achieved a startling outcome. 18 Russian officers are dead, and it all happened because of some dry grass and a little bit of fire. All 18 officers were part of Russia's 35th Combined Arms Army, and they all sequestered themselves away in that unit's headquarters. It's not yet known why they were there. Perhaps they were conducting a meeting to figure out how to assault Ukraine's defenses after the abject failure of Russia's summer offensive in Zaporizhzhia. Or perhaps those officers were in hiding, desperately attempting to stay as far away from the front lines as possible while believing they were safe in the rear. They weren't safe. Ukraine got them anyway. The obvious question is how, and the answer comes from an interesting source, the I Want to Live project. That project was created by Ukraine early on in its war against Russia to provide any of Putin's soldiers who were looking for a way out of the fighting with a way to surrender into captivity in a safe way. Think of it as a more convenient form of surrender for the digital age. Instead of waving a white flag as drones buzz overhead, a Russian soldier can speak to a I Want to Live via Telegram to arrange their surrender. All of this is noted because I Want to Live typically isn't the sort of program that goes out of its way to announce the success of Ukraine's strikes against Russian forces. But this time was different. As Ukraine's sabotage killed so many Russian officers, I Want to Live may be using the operation to send a message to any Russian soldiers who may have been on the fence about using its services. Their officers are dead. They'll be next if they don't surrender. Regardless of the reason why this organization decided to share the news of what happened, it's now clear exactly what Ukraine pulled off. And it was all remarkably simple, as I Want to Live explained. On August 30, 2025, an act of sabotage occurred near the village of Voskresenka. Unknown well-wishers set fire to dry grass near the command post of the 35th Army. That's an interesting starting point. The mention of unknown well-wishers tells us that this wasn't an official military operation carried out by one of Ukraine's intelligence or security services, such as HUR or the SBU. Instead, it seems likely that the attack was carried out by unknown members of a partisan group that operates in the shadows and does whatever it can to aid Ukraine in its fight against Russia. What matters less is who carried it out. What matters more is the result. The fire quickly spread to the command post facilities and dugouts. Due to the smoke and carbon monoxide filling the command post, the operational officers were unable to escape, reports I Want to Live. The picture being painted here is of Russian officers being trapped in a hell from which there was no escape. What started as a small fire outside appears to have quickly enveloped the buildings in which those officers were hiding. They all had a choice: brave the rampaging flames outside or take their chances at survival as their lungs filled with smoke. Neither choice is a good one, and the outcome is devastating for Russia. 18 of its officers are now dead. Usually, when reporting on one of these types of sabotage operations, that would be all the information received. But as noted earlier, there is a reason why it took half a month for news to break of this August 30 sabotage. I Want to Live wasn't satisfied with ifs, buts and maybes. It wanted to confirm the damage done, which has led it to being able to do something that isn't seen often. It shared the names, ranks and roles of all 18 of the officers believed to be killed in the single Zaporizhzhia inferno. Not all 18 are shared here, but some of the highlights from Ukraine's perspective are worth noting. A high-ranking officer named Colonel Ilya Makhotin is among the dead. He served as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Russia's Missile and Artillery Department of the 35th Combined Arms Army, which means he was a major figure in a department that covers two of the most important weapons Russia uses to destroy Ukraine cities. At 45 years old, Makhotin likely had at least a decade, likely closer to two, of experience. This was a senior figure who would have been instrumental to Russia's assaults in Zaporizhzhia. Now he's gone. The victim of a weapon far more primal than anything he oversaw in his department. Another important name on the list of casualties is Lieutenant Colonel Ruslan Shigabutdinov, who Military reports was responsible for the 35th Combined Arms Army's operational planning. In other words, this was the man who organized Russia's assaults in Zaporizhzhia. Without him, Russia's troops on the ground will likely end up scattering, running around like headless chickens with no direction from an officer who's been dead for over 2 weeks. While one could make the case that these were the two heaviest hitters that Ukraine managed to take out with its sabotage attack, several other important officers of the 35th Combined Arms Army died on August 30. Major Rustam Setdarov was a senior mathematical modeling officer, which likely means he was a man who dealt with data and gave high-end overviews of the likely outcomes of Russia's operations based on the data. Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Pashabekov also died. He headed the 35th Arms Fire and Nuclear Destruction Planning Department. Pashabekov's death was the most ironic, killed by the very thing that his work is supposed to fix. The majority of the other officers killed on August 30 were juniors working in departments related to artillery, electronic warfare, and air defense. All told, Military reports, Ukraine has been able to confirm 13 officers were killed because that's how many have been evacuated from the fire its partisans started. The figure of 18 comes from the fact that 5 Russian officers are still lost underneath the rubble that the fire caused. Those officers are presumed dead, and assuming they've passed, Russia's 35th Combined Arms Army will have also lost its Deputy Chief of Staff of Intelligence and one of its most important unmanned aerial vehicle operators. There is no overstating how massive a win this sabotage operation was for Ukraine. However, there are still questions about whether the operation was quite as effective as I Want to Live claims it to be. For instance, the Kyiv Independent's report on the operation comes with a disclaimer that the outlet wasn't able to verify the claims I Want to Live made. That isn't surprising. Verification would require Russia to admit that it just lost 12.5 of the most important military personnel it had in Zaporizhzhia. This is a country that's claimed dozens of times over that it's debris and not direct hits that cause damage when Ukraine launches long-range drone strikes. There's no chance that Russia will ever confirm that it lost such an important chunk of the 35th Combined Arms Army, all thanks to one operation. But there is evidence that I Want to Live is telling the truth. Obituaries and funeral services often provide insight into the validity of Ukraine's claims when Russia won't confirm a thing. And on September 4, before the news broke of the sabotage operation, the Necromancer X account shared the funeral details of Ruslan Shigabutdinov. He was the operational planning officer mentioned earlier. Necromancer confirmed that Shigabutdinov was born in 1990 and that he always asked the Almighty to grant him a long life. There was also a hint that this operation had been carried out back on September 1st, the Kyiv Post reports. It says that the former advisor to the exiled mayor of occupied Mariupol, Petro Andriushchenko, took to Telegram to claim that some sort of operation had been carried out. He revealed that the Mariupol resistance, which appears to be a partisan group, worked alongside HUR to carry out the sabotage. So HUR may not have been involved officially, however, it clearly provided some form of intelligence, perhaps the location of the officers and when they would be gathered in one place, that Ukrainian partisans then used to take out 18 of Russia's most important military men. Andriushchenko was jubilant in his announcement, though he didn't provide any information about how the sabotage was carried out. 17 officers and 1 private were killed, he said. The officers were leading an offensive in one of the Zaporizhzhia sectors. Now there will be no offensive. At the time, This seemed like a strangely bold claim with no real evidence to back it up. Now, it's clear that Andriy Yushchenko was telling the truth. 13 officers are confirmed dead, 5 more are presumed dead, given that they're trapped under rubble. Plus, Russia's Zaporizhzhia offensive lies in ruins, which brings us nicely to what this bold sabotage attack will mean for the future of the Ukraine war. The focus will return to Zaporizhzhia in a moment. First, don't underestimate the catastrophic impact that losing 18 officers in a single day will have on the 35th Combined Arms Army. At the risk of stating the obvious, officers are typically some of the most experienced and talented of any military's personnel. Granted, that may not always be the case in Russia thanks to its corruption problem, but by and large, the people that Ukraine took out were dangerous, if not as individuals, then because they were the organizational minds behind a military force of around 10,000 soldiers per Medusa. Russia can't afford to keep losing experienced and talented people. One of the reasons that Russia has performed so poorly in Ukraine, especially after the initial year of its invasion, is that it's lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Many of these soldiers were part of elite units or were otherwise veterans of past combat operations, with their deaths creating a dearth of experience within the country's military. Russia's enormous casualty rate, which Ukraine's Ministry of Finance says amounts to almost 1.1 million soldiers who are dead, injured or captured, has forced Russia into a perpetual cycle of having to replace experienced personnel with fresh recruits who simply aren't capable of carrying out complex missions inside Ukraine. The United States Naval Institute, or USNI, made this point clear in a May 2025 report to the US Congress on the state of Russia's military performance. The Russian military has suffered significant losses in personnel and equipment. Its performance has been hindered by a rigid command and control structure, a weakened core of trained and professional units, and a reliance on tactics that have contributed to high casualty rates, the USNI said. The same report also highlighted that Russia has made many attempts to reform its low-level leadership, which is the area under which these 18 officers would have fallen. But even after all of those attempts, a Soviet-style top-down hierarchical command system is still in place, with very little autonomy among Russia's rank and file. While every military in the world has command structures, Russia's is so rigid that officers are both handcuffed by whatever commands they receive from upstairs and are essentially in charge of ensuring those commands reach soldiers on the battlefield. When officers are lost, Russia's high command loses its ability to influence operations on the ground because the rigid chain is broken. Russia's soldiers aren't able to adapt, and offensives fall by the wayside as a result. The Jamestown Foundation reveals another problem. Russia's 18 dead soldiers in Zaporizhzhia are going to have to be replaced. So the question becomes, where are those replacements going to come from? It's unlikely that Russia will have 18 replacements, or at least 18 skilled replacements waiting in the wings. That doesn't mean that warm bodies won't fill the vacancies left behind in Zaporizhzhia. But, as the Jamestown Foundation notes, Russia has something of an illusory success story in place when it comes to its officers. Despite stable enrollment numbers in military academies and recruitment from civil universities, Russia continues to struggle with a shortage of low and mid-ranking officers. The temporary growth of the officer corps, fueled by the partial mobilization, may reverse once mobilization ends, the foundation says. It's the once mobilization ends part that will concern Russia. Sure, it's churning out people who are technically qualified to be officers in the sense that they've gone through the appropriate academic channels. Russia had more than 60,000 students enrolled across its 41 military academies, universities, and similar institutions between 2022 and 2023. However, it's also engaged in an attritional war with Ukraine as those students qualify. What often happens is that somebody who might have become an officer gets sent to serve on the front lines. They die or get seriously injured, meaning their training goes to waste. Those who survive are promoted when other officers die or are thrust into leadership positions on the battlefield long before they're ready. Russia ends up with a lot of officers who aren't fit for the job. Nobody knows if the 18 officers Ukraine took out on August 30 were among the more competent Russia has to offer. However, one could bet decent money that those who replaced those officers aren't going to meet the lost group's standards based on a lack of experience alone. And that leads back to Russia's Zaporizhzhia offensive and Andriy Yushchenko's claims that there will be now no offensive. That isn't likely to be the case. Major battlefield losses haven't stopped Russia from ordering constant assaults in the past, even if those assaults amount to throwing cannon fodder at Ukraine's defenses. Still, the Zaporizhzhia situation already wasn't looking good for Russia before it lost 18 officers in the region. It's only going to get a lot worse now that those officers are dead. The Kyiv Post provides the basics in its report on the 18 dead Russian officers. During the 12 days leading up to Ukraine's sabotage campaign, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Oleksandr Syrsky, said that Russia was redeploying troops from the Sumy region to Zaporizhzhia. Syrsky made those comments on August 18, with the implication being that an offensive was being planned. 4 days later, confirmation of Russia's attempted regrouping in the region came from Ukraine's Southern Defense Forces spokesperson Vladislav Voloshin. But by September, whatever Russia was trying to do in Zaporizhzhia had failed. Now it's clear why. The officers leading that offensive had all died. By August 27, the Ukrainian World Congress was reporting on the offensive's failure, noting that Ukraine's front line in Zaporizhzhia had held despite Russia's assaults. It was only 3 days later that the 18 officers were killed, and it stands to reason that Russia's assaults after August 27 would have been at least a little more effective if those officers were still alive. Ukraine can't become complacent in Zaporizhzhia. Russia still controls about 3/4 of the region, including the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So Ukraine still has a lot of work to do after this sabotage operation. On September 18, the new Voice of Ukraine also reported that Voloshin is again saying that Russia is attempting to regroup in Zaporizhzhia. Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has also hinted that more is coming. During an interview this month, Zelensky said, "They are preparing for 2 more offensive operations in the fall. There were already 3 of them, and ahead there are 2 more heavy offensive campaigns." Zelensky added, "On the whole, I'm truly pleased that the last 3 Russian offensive drives have failed, though they are planning 2 more serious offensives." Ukraine scored big with the August 30 sabotage mission, but Zelensky is warning against complacency as more offensives are coming. How effective those offensives will be with 18 important officers dead remains to be seen. One final point to make here is about the nature of what Ukraine pulled off on August 30. This was yet another sabotage operation in a string that has rocked Russia in the rear during 2025. Russia should have been aware that these types of operations were coming. Back in June 2023, CNN reported that Ukraine had cultivated sabotage agents both inside Russia and in Ukraine's occupied territories. At the time, those agents were being given drones to launch attacks independent of Ukraine's military. Now it seems like HUR is feeding information to these partisan saboteurs so they can do more damage than ever. A perfect example came back in March, when TVP World reported on a Ukrainian sabotage operation that resulted in it disabling a diesel locomotive carrying military equipment bound for Voronezh. Other acts of sabotage have seen Ukraine hit railway depots and similar targets, though there perhaps hasn't been a strike quite as bold as the one just learned of in Zaporizhzhia. The point here is simple. Russia's forces are vulnerable to sabotage. Ukraine has realized that, and it's taking advantage by hitting Russia on its own territory and in occupied regions, both of which are places where Russia's military personnel believe they're safe as long as they're not fighting on the front lines. The information exchange between partisan resistance groups and the Ukrainian military is also a danger to Russia, as the Atlantic Council explains. Resistant groups also support the Ukrainian military with critical intelligence on everything from Russian troop movements to the deployment of air defense batteries. This has enabled a large number of precision strikes on high-value targets, while also proving important for the conduct of major operations such as Ukraine's successful September 2022 counter-offensive in the Kharkiv region, the Council said in February 2025. What happened on August 30 was likely a result of that sort of information exchange, especially given that the HUR was supposedly involved. Russia now has to wonder if Ukraine can take out 18 officers in Zaporizhzhia simply by starting a fire. What else is it capable of doing behind the front lines? Well, there's at least one answer to that question. Thanks to a brilliant sabotage operation that Ukrainian partisans just completed inside Russia itself. Ukraine struck from the shadows to decapitate the Russian snake, and Putin's forces are reeling. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more up-to-date videos covering Ukraine's latest strikes in the Russian rear.